Hello and welcome to another Watercolours with Caroline. Today we're going to paint a lotus flower, or maybe you call it a water lily. This was photographed by Debra on her trip to Thailand earlier this year, and she sent me lots of lovely photos, so thank you, Debra. You'll probably need some lemon yellow or a nice bright yellow, and we're going to mix some beautiful dark greens. So get your paints ready, a piece of 5x7 watercolour paper, and paint along with me. So I have started the recording, and I have my finished one here, and my photo. When I print the photo in a JPEG, it has to be reduced so that you can actually send the file, so it's much more fuzzy. That's why I sent you the actual photo. You'll get a crisper, clearer idea from the actual photo. So there's a couple of things we want to think about before we start, and that is we're going to try and leave this light rim around some of the lily pad leaves that we're going to put some of the red on. And this leaf, which is curled up, it's curled shut, and you can see the underneath pattern of the green and the red. We're going to work on that just because it's an interesting feature. We can work on some wet in wet, light green and dark red and so forth. And what makes the really light lemon yellow stand out, if you can see right here, is when we can put those lovely, lovely dark greens beside it. Like this lemon yellow, before we have any dark green beside it, is very pale and washed out, and your tendency will be to add more yellow because you think it looks too pale and washed out. I need to add more yellow. Whereas what we really have to do is add more darks close to the lemon and the very light violet color to make them stand out. So that's sort of our goal this time, is stay very light with the very light with the flower, and very, very dark as we go into the dark greens here too. So our first thing we're going to do, I just have to make sure I do it exactly how I say. We're going to wash the entire paper with lemon yellow. Now, because it's a very pale color, we're not going to wet the paper first. We don't have to do a flat wash like I practiced last week. It's good if you get it fairly flat. And you need to use a number 10, at least a number 10 round, or something close to a number 10 round, so you can get your color on. So I washed my if I'm using like a light color like lemon yellow, I do like to go wash my palette out so that I have a nice clean base for the yellow, because yellow can get contaminated so quickly. So I'm going to put the water on here and the lemon yellow and get a nice wet wash of lemon that I can wash over the entire paper, because even the green is going to have the lemon behind it to give it kind of a glow. So get your lemon ready in your big brush. I'll put that close to me. Move this over a little bit. And I buy pads of the dollar store watercolor paper for testing all my paints. They're only $4 for a nice big pad, and it's not the same as your good paper, but at least for testing it's fine. And I just want to get used to testing the strength of your paint when you've mixed it, so you don't start with it too dark or too light. And I think that's, it has to be fairly subtle. So going to make sure you can see my palette and my painting. Nice big brush. And you remember how we did the flat wash side to side? Well, you want to do that kind of a motion, but we're not being so particular, about tipping it, finding the bead. What we just want to do is get this wash on nice and quickly, side to side. Don't go back over anything unless you really have to. Make sure you've mixed up enough you can get over the entire paper. And Make sure you get up to your tape. Don't push your paint under your tape because that can lead to some bleeding, but do make sure you get up to the edge so that you've covered your paper. And if you do have quite a bit of paint on your tape, I like to at least clean it up so I don't get a back run. And even that's looking quite, even though I mixed up a very light mixture, it is looking quite bright to me anyway. And I'm looking at my photo, so I might, it's still very wet, so there's some very light leaves here. I might just pick up with my thirsty brush, pick up a little bit of the paint where I want the very, very light petals. These ones that come out against the dark, really, really dark green, I want them really lovely and light. And pulling the paint off like this with a thirsty brush, it's going to give you such a soft look, much softer than if you tried to avoid those areas or paint each one individually. And just the tips of these petals are very light. So I'm sort of lifting up from the tips. And of course I know now I got plenty of time now that's soaking in. It will dry fairly fast because I didn't wet the paper first. That's another thing. If you wet the paper first, you're going to dilute your wash even more, and it's going to take twice as long to dry. So this will dry fairly quickly so that you can work on it. It's lost its shine already, so I know I can work on the center and put in the lovely dark center to the flower. I'm going to use my little tiny number 2 brush for the center, and I broke down and bought Cadmium Red again. I just can't find another color that's like it. And M. Graham didn't have a cadmium-free Cadmium Red, so I just broke down and bought one. I can't find anything that's the same. It's so beautiful. Look at that lovely rich red from M. Graham. I might add a little bit of bright yellow, either cadmium yellow or Azo Yellow to that, because this is a very bright orangey center. So I'm going to add a little bit of my Azo Yellow. You can use cadmium yellow or even your lemon yellow, just to orange that red up a bit. And right in the center of that flower, it's very, very dark. So I'm just going to put that on. It's going to, let me zoom in. It's going to go a little bit fuzzy because it's not quite dry yet. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We're going to do a little bit of this wet in wet, and we're not going for photorealism. More, what are the values in this flower and what are the colors? So I'm going to get my photo, not very good photo here, which is actually not as dark as the photo I'm looking at on my computer. So what I like to do is when I'm trying to find a value and a color, this is my little homemade, everything I make's out of a piece of cardboard, Carolyn. A little piece of cardboard, that's my go-to tool. Put a little hole in the cardboard and that isolates the center of the flower there and kind of tells me what I need to be mixing, and I can put my color next to it like this and I can see that it's close. It's maybe not quite as orange. Maybe I need a little bit more yellow. Let's try it here. And that's a bit too orange, so something between that and that. And it's going to give me the center of my flower. And like I said, it's not photorealism. We can just eyeball it. There's a little bit of yellow still wet, so it will mix with the red. And later, we'll do all of the other detail later. You know, the detail between the negative painting between these, I guess, stamens in the center. I'm not really sure what you call them. I'm always confused as to parts of the flower. Even when I look it up, I get confused. I'm going to put a little bit more red in the center there. And then when you're ready, when yours is at that point, you've got your lemon just starting to dry. You've got a little bit of reddish sort of orange in the middle. Just use the bright red that you have and mix a tiny bit of bright yellow with it. And don't be worried if it's quite strong. Do you know what? Red really fades when it dries. Red, ironically, because it's such a strong color, fades quite a lot when it dries, and even it's one of those ones that's not as light fast. So don't worry too much if it's fairly red. It will be fine, especially when we get all of this green on there. It will be great. And then we're going to get a piece of cheaper paper if you have some, or just an odd end of your paper from somewhere, and we're going to mix all the colors that we need and make sure we test them out to make sure that they're good, and you've got something equivalent. So the first one I would like you to mix is the rose and the cobalt blue to make that very, very delicate violet that is, it's in these petals on the left hand side, and it's really delicate. That's why we put the lemon on first, because it's much easier to kind of blend this violet in over the top when the lemon is dry. If you're trying to blend the lemon and the violet at the same time, where they touch tends to make grey and doesn't give you that beautiful floral look. So I thought it would be easier probably to get the lemon on dry first and then put the violet over the top. So let's try mixing the rose and the cobalt blue to make that very, very delicate violet. And if you have a piece of paper to test them on, that's really great. We'll do a test of them. So I'm going to get my 8 brush because I like to mix with a slightly bigger brush. The reason I use cobalt instead of ultramarine, because they're very, very similar colors, is that the cobalt is much softer. It's difficult to make cobalt dark because it's a similar blue to ultramarine. I'll put them side by side. This is cobalt. This is ultramarine. They're both quite warm blues. Ultramarine is a little bit darker, and ultramarine you can make quite strong and dark, and it is a more granulating color. But cobalt is similar but very soft, less granulating, and difficult to make dark. So we want something very soft for this violet. And then your Quinacridone Rose, or some color in your palette that says rose. And my Quinacridone Rose is pretty strong, so I only have to add a tiny little bit to get the violet color, and I want to test that to see how strong that is. Let's put it on here. Surprising how dilute they need to be. I put more water with it, still quite strong. And I'm going to mix 2 of them. I'm going to mix that one, which is fairly bluish still, which is good, but I'm going to mix another one that's a bit more pink. So I have two violets. So beside it, I'm going to mix another one, bit of cobalt, bit more rose, a little bit more rose, and I've got a violet that's a bit more rosy, a bit more pink. I want to be able to have a warmer one. There we go. And I added a little bit more water, so it's got a little bit more pink in it. The difference on this is Arch cotton paper, this one, and this is dollar store paper, and you can see a big difference in the way it takes the paint and the texture. So I think I've got a couple of good violets mixed up there. So you do the same. You make sure you've got them ready. You're not going to use that much because we're going to be very delicate with them, but you still need to have them ready to go. Even if they dry up a little bit and you have to add a bit of water, they'll be ready for you. We're also going to use your bright yellow, like your Azo Yellow or your cadmium yellow. So I have my little bit of orange I made. I'll clean that up. And I'll put my Azo Yellow there. And the reason I choose this one, it's by M. Graham, is it is so transparent but so bright, and it's just one pigment. And I haven't found another yellow that is that bright, that transparent, and that gorgeous in just one pigment. So that's why I use it. I always used to use cadmium yellow, and that's my Azo Yellow. Got a little puddle of that ready, and see how gorgeous it looks with the violet colors, the complementariness of them. Now we also need to mix a few greens for when we do the lily pads. I'm going to be putting in quite a lot of green. So you want some quite bright greens for starting off, and then we're going to go darker and darker as we move through the painting, doing several layers to get it that dark. So the first green you want is really, really light, a beautiful light green, and lemon yellow and cobalt blue. That's going to give you a soft, light green. And this is for using on some of the lily leaves. So make sure it is really, see, I have lots of lemon yellow. So it's almost like a lime green, and just tiny, tiny touch of cobalt blue, tiny touch. And that's what I mean. It's so easy to overdo the blue and get a green that's too dark. This one needs to be just lemon with the slightest touch of cobalt blue, because we want to use that. Imagine this is your lily leaf. We want to use that to put some shadows on some of the lily leaves. So we don't want it to be really, really dark. Oh, and test that one out. Test it out next to your lemon yellow and check that it's really lovely light green. And if you're really, really good, if you're getting good at this, you should be actually writing what you've done. So you remember, if you've got your little test sheet, you can put it with your painting. So this was Cobalt Blue plus, mine was Quinacridone Rose, and this was same, and this one was plus more Quinacridone Rose. This was the Azo Yellow, and this was the Lemon Yellow plus Cobalt Blue. I'll have those, you know, if you don't have notes, like I've got notes here. If you don't have notes, you won't remember tomorrow. I guarantee you'll be like, I can't remember what color I used to mix that. So it's helpful to make yourself a little note. It's helpful if you put this little sheet in with if you keep them in a file or something, pop it in there with them. And if you ever do this again, you have everything at your fingertips. You have all the colors you mixed, the colors you used, the mixes that you used. It's easier than actually reading through all the notes. So then I've used a sap green as well, because it's a very easy, quick green to use. But if you don't have sap green, you can mix one with a bright yellow and either a cobalt blue or an ultramarine blue. I'll show you my sap green. The only two sap greens I really like are by Daniel Smith or Core, Golden Core paints. Everybody else uses too many pigments and they're not transparent. Can you see? Oops, I got eraser junk on there. You see how transparent that sap green is on my palette? Like, it's just so beautiful. So I'm just going to put that down, but we'll test some mixes to see if we can make one if you don't have sap green. That's sap green. If you don't have it, let's see how close we can come. So first of all, I'm going to use my Azo Yellow, or you can use Cadmium Yellow, and I'll add some Ultramarine Blue. And I'll put that beside the Sap Green that I just painted. So that's Ultramarine and my Azo Yellow. It's very close to the Sap Green. And let's try Azo Yellow with Cobalt Blue instead. It should make just a slightly softer green. And let's put that down. It's so similar, right? So similar. If it looks a bit too blue, grab a bit more yellow. Let's grab it a bit more yellow. So any of those are going to be adequate for you to mix a green. I can also add a little bit of Phthalo Green to that. I've got my, so I have my, I've lost what I've got here. Hang on, let's get rid of that mess. I'm going to have my Ultramarine Blue, because that's always a great mix. The Ultramarine Blue with a nice bright yellow. And then I'm going to add a little bit of Phthalo Green to really pump it up a little bit. I think you can see that immediately it's a much bluer, darker green. So this was Cobalt Blue. And this was Ultramarine and Azo, and then Phthalo Green. Now everybody asks, what if you don't have Phthalo Green? And I said, well, you can use Phthalo Blue to make something similar. So let's look at Phthalo Green on its own. And the reason we don't use Phthalo Green on its own for these lily pads is it's too unnatural and too bright. It's great mixed with the other colors, but on its own, it is just a bit too unnatural and too bright. So we have to do something to it to get it, to tone it down. We can add blue, we can add sap green, we can add yellow. All of those things will tone it down, and we can also add the reds to make the deep greens. So let's try mixing something close to a Phthalo Green with a bright yellow. So I've got my Azo Yellow, and I'm using Phthalo Blue. I have Phthalo Blue green shade. And we'll see how close I can come. I'm keeping adding the Phthalo Blue till I get something. Now it's not going to be as transparent. There, that's very close. Not going to be as transparent, but it's going to be pretty close. I think you'll agree. So that's Phthalo Blue plus my Azo Yellow. And the reason it's not as transparent is the yellow is going to opaque it up a little bit. And I have to think, I lost my cheat sheet. Hang on, let's find my cheat sheet. I have lots of colours on here. We may not need them all, but as long as we can look at all the greens we can mix with these few colours. One that I have discovered, you probably don't have the Perylene Maroon or Perylene Violet. Some makes call it Perylene Violet, some call it Perylene Maroon. The one I bought was from M. Graham, my favourite, so it's Perylene Maroon. It's this dark colour just here. So I'm going to put some Perylene Maroon down. And some of you were still on last week when I showed you what the Perylene Maroon looks like. Really, really rich dark red. And we're going to mix that with some Phthalo Green until we get a beautiful, beautiful, rich dark green for our final, when we want our final shading, our final shadows. And like I said, I'll give you some alternatives because you may not have Perylene Maroon. I didn't have any till recently. So really rich dark green. But you could probably get the similar color if you have alizarin crimson, which a lot of people have. It's a basic color, not as deep and transparent or light fast as Perylene Maroon, but still look a really rich dark color. And I'm going to mix that with Phthalo Green. Immediately you have a gorgeous, gorgeous dark color. And I'll put that underneath, and really not a lot of difference. So if you have alizarin crimson or something, a dark red that's very similar, you can use that. And this is one of the reasons that Phthalo Green and Phthalo Blue are such great colors to have. On their own, they're a bit too much. They're a bit too bright, a bit too intense. But when you start mixing them with some other colors, you can get just a huge range of colors and transparent colors, which are very hard to get because so many paints are leaning towards opaque or granulating, so you can never get that clear dark with them. So we've got a whole range hopefully here, and if you have a sap green, you can use that a lot. You can mix it with the yellow, you can mix it with the blue, you can mix it with the phthalo green to transform it into lots of different greens as we go along. Now, when we do this curled up leaf here, you can use alizarin crimson for the red. You can use, if you have the Perylene Maroon, you can use that. If you have cadmium red, you could mix it with a little bit of burnt sienna and you still get a very similar color. Let's just zoom in and put some alternatives. So this is my Perylene Maroon. An alternative would be alizarin crimson. Put that there. I'm just going to put alizarin. And then I'm going to mix, if I don't have either of those, I'm going to mix my cadmium red with some burnt sienna and see if I can get something dark reddish. There's my cadmium red. And grab the other one, burnt sienna. None of them are going to be as good, but it's not quite as bright, but it's still a lovely rich dark red. So this is cadmium red and burnt sienna. And there'd be plenty of other things you could mix too. You could probably mix your magenta with something, some burnt sienna maybe, your red and your magenta. Let's try the Quinacridone magenta with some cadmium red, see what we get there. Bit too bright, a little bit too bright. Let's add a little bit of, what should we add to it? Let's try a tiny bit of Phthalo Green, just a tiny bit, not a lot. I'm trying a tiny bit of, it gets duller and duller the more colors that you add, but just adding a tiny bit of the Phthalo Green to the magenta and the red also kind of takes it down to a deep red. So that was Quinacridone magenta, cadmium red, and a little bit of Phthalo Green. And I mean a little bit, just a little bit. So we've got a range here of, you know, nice dark reds that you can use. They're going to look perfectly fine if you don't have the colours I'm using. I've got a bunch of colours mixed up, which is good. Let's get my brushes here. And by now, my yellow is dry, completely dry enough to work on now that I've been doing all that. Getting my paints ready, making a little colour chart, and figuring out where we're going to go next. So we're going to start darkening up some of the center petals of the flower, because close to the center they're a deeper yellow. So sort of close to the middle here, we're going to get a little bit of deeper yellow on them. And if you can see, as they go down into the flower, we have that orangey color. So we can add a little bit of cadmium red to our cadmium yellow or azo yellow to deepen that as we go in the petal. We're going to work one petal at a time now that we've sort of got the whole thing yellow. And I'm going to get a couple of tubs of clean water. So it's easier to get a soft look to the petal if you wet it first. You don't have to. You can do some of them completely dry if that is easier, or you can do a little bit of each. I'm going to start with this petal up here, and I need to look at, yeah, so close to the end of the, and the reason to wet it is close to the end of this petal is still very, very light. So I want a very soft transition coming down into the center of the flower. And now I have my little #2 brush and my Azo Yellow, and I want to come down into the center with the darker yellow. But I don't want the tip of this petal to be dark yellow, just where it comes down here. And that's why I wet the tip. And I actually want those stamens to be dark yellow. I'm going to come around them with negative painting later. They're quite bright. So I can come right down with those. And then I can work on this just slowly now, one petal at a time. I'm actually going to mix up a little bit of a more orangey yellow. Now you can either use gamboge, if you have gamboge, because that's a very orangey yellow, or you can just mix some red and yellow. It's making a clean spot. Because like I say, when I'm using yellow, I like the tray nice and clean. So I'm going to get a little bit of gamboge, because that's an easy orangey yellow to use, and a little bit of Azo Yellow with a touch of cadmium red. It goes red so quickly. A bit more yellow in. Just so I got a couple of darker oranges, because right in the center is pretty orangey. I'm using my gamboge for now. And I'm actually going to go over some of those stamens with that nice dark orangey yellow. And sometimes the petal rather, is not that orangey. I'm looking at this one next, sort of next in line, going around clockwise, and it's a more greeny color, this one. So I'm going to not do it as bright yellow. again, I'm going to wet the end very gently. Don't want piles of water on there. And I'm going to get that very, very light green that I mixed up somewhere. Has to be super, super light. And I'm going to come down, like it has to be almost lemon, not very green. Make that shadow, that shaded part, a little bit green. It doesn't matter if you don't get dark enough on your first layer, because we can go in with a few darker veins and shadows when it's dry. I will skip the one underneath because I don't want to go next to a wet petal. And then I'll come round to this one here, which is quite orangey yellow underneath. So that's why you kind of need to have a few puddles of paint ready mixed up. Again, I'm going to wet the end of the petal. Get my orangey. I'm mixing now my Azo Yellow and I've got my Azo Yellow here, my gamboge here, and I'm mixing a little bit of that gamboge with that Azo Yellow so I get a more orangey tinge just down here at the base. And then I'm going to wash my brush. I have a little sponge to wipe it on. And just with a damp brush, not too wet, I'm just going to ease that colour into the wet petal. It will flow up a little bit into that colour, but give a very soft transition to the petal. The next, I don't want to go too fast, slow down me. The next one's going to be even darker. So I definitely want to go with my orangey gamboge colour in here. A little bit of wet. I'm going to get my orangey colour and go quite dark in this one. And when it gets very close to the center, it's even more orange, but I would like to do that in a third layer rather than have all of the dark orange flood back. I'm lifting a little with my thirsty brush, and when that's dry I can put on the even deeper orangey shadows that go back there. And I'm trying to not work on any that touch so I don't get any bleeding of paint. This one next to it, again, pretty dark, so again I'm going to have that orangey colour paint, a little bit of, bring my tray over. You probably can't see my tray, I've zoomed in. And I'm not even going to wet this one. I want that dark paint to be all, that orangey paint to be nice and strong throughout. This one's sort of facing away from us. And again, put a little bit of red in possibly later. I could try it now, I just don't want it to flood into the rest of it. I've got just red, cadmium red on my brush. I'm just, that'll probably, you have to be delicate, be really delicate. I'm going to show you, this is how much cadmium red I have on my brush here. Not too wet. And right where that petal comes in here, I just touched my brush there. And you can see how quickly, I touched it 3 times, you can see how quickly it floods in. That's why I want to be very, very careful with putting any red in at this stage. I'm consulting my photo, and again, just going to suck up a little bit of that red. I have the outer, the curled up past the petal. It looks very white on my screen, but it actually is that lovely lemon yellow. I have the curled up part, just leaving it lemon yellow, nice and light. So we're going around doing the same thing at each one. I'm checking my photo reference and seeing where I'm going next. I'm going to this next curled, the next curled in one here, wetting it a little bit, getting some orangey yellow and putting that in. The outer part of this one's a little bit lighter, so with my wet brush I'm just going to ease that soft transition. And the one next to it is quite dark. I've mixed my little bit of cadmium red that I had with my gamboge, mix them together, and this one is pretty dark in here. I'll pop that one in. At some point, as the petals get bigger, I'm going to have to switch to my number 4 brush so I can get a little bit more paint on. This one here is fairly dry now, so I got my Azo Yellow. So underneath this one I'm going to paint it in with the Azo Yellow. And just over to one side and close to the center, I'm going to put in my red mixed with my gamboge, or red mixed with yellow to make that more orangey as it comes down into the flower. And anytime you get too much paint, just use a thirsty brush. That's a clean brush that's almost dry, and just pick a little bit up if you need to. And don't go too dark. You'll be surprised when you put the green on how light this needs to be. But the center can be stronger for sure. That's okay. Gotta work out where we are. So we've done this one and all these ones. And let's work now. We've got a lot going on in here. I'm going to look at this one right next to the one that I just did, and that's very similar to the one that I just did, so let's do that one as well. I'm going to wet the top edge that's pretty light, and then after the wet edge I'm going to put in the Azo Yellow or your Cadmium Yellow, and I'm going to my orangey mix, and right over this side I'm going to put a little bit of that orangey mix. So we've got a transition from lemon and water to Azo, bright yellow, and then a little bit of orange yellow on the side. I'm going to take again, when I get my cadmium red, I put the tip of my brush in it, and I get about this much. Not much water, because if you're going into wet paint, you don't want much water or you'll have a flood happening. And I'm just right down deep where that petal comes in deep here. I'm putting the tiniest bit of cadmium red, and then I'm taking a little bit of it off and spreading it up. Just doesn't matter if you get streaks, because there are streaks in the petals, in the actual structure of them, so that's okay to have streaks. So see what I mean? As you come down into the center, you want to have it getting darker. We will put a lot of dark in this center when it's dry. And I'm looking at what we've got here. Get a little bit of that red. Put a little, now this has dried up a little bit. I'm going to get a little bit of that red, tiny bit on my little brush. I'm going to put a little bit more in this one. It's almost dry. Just coming down here. We've got some of those darker ones done. And then I want to work on the ones on the outside. So these all have a chance to dry up a little bit, and we can work on some of the lilac ones on the outside. So for doing the lilac, I want to start with the most lilac one, which is the one sticking out here, or close to this one here, you know, one of these big ones over here. It's helpful to start with one of the big ones so that you have more room to play and you can put more violet on if you need to. I'm going to switch to my number 4 brush for some of the work, so I'm not working with too small a brush. And I want to wet this entire inside of this petal over here. And now I've got to be really, really careful how much paint I'm putting on. I'm going back to my number 2 brush for putting on the violet paint. Start where it's darkest. It's darkest close to the center. So I am putting the pinky, I've got the pinky violet close to the center here. I want to bring it under the fold of the petal here. Under the fold of the petal, this side or the edge. And then I want to leave the center part unpainted, no color showing through. There is actually quite a ridge down the center, so I could, as this starts to dry a little bit, I can pull my brush down that ridge and make more of a ridge in the center there. A big water blob. I'm going to get a little bit more rose. I'm going to get some rose all on its own, so I can add a touch of rose anywhere that I want a little bit more pink happening, because this is a good lilac color. And I'm going to get the teeniest touch of rose on the tip of my number 2 brush. And I want a little bit of rose. Oh, see, that's the teeniest bit and it's still a lot. I want a little bit of rose at the ends of this petal. And I've got a wet brush. I'm just easing that little bit of rose in. And I might think, it's such a small amount, why did you even bother? Little tiny amounts count. I'm just going along the edge of that one with that little bit of rose, and then down where that center ridge is going to be. It's just a tiny bit, but it's subtle, and it will show up when you have all the green behind it. And then I'm looking at the one next to it. I'll skip that for now because it's too close. We want to keep a nice dry edge there, but we can go up to this one up here. It's not touching any wet. And that one's even more delicate in color, so we want to be really, really delicate when we put the violet color on that one. Again, we're going to wet this petal. I'm looking at my screen and mine looks very pale. That's I'm going to take the camera down a notch. Let's see if it is much more yellow than my camera is showing. I think it's probably the lighting. I have quite strong lighting in here, so the video shows up and it tends to wash it out just a little bit, because I have a more blue daylight lighting in here. Right, let's get small brush, a little bit of the pinky rosy violet, and again start down near the center. I'm getting a little tiny bit of rose, tiny bit of rose on my brush. And I'm going to leave the other side just yellow. My rose went over the edge there, doesn't matter. I'm going to put dark green behind it. It's fine. It's a slow process, isn't it? It's quite slow doing this. The one next to it going clockwise is just kind of yellow, so we can wet that one. And I'm just going to get my bright yellow and just put some bright yellow down the sides, which is actually touching the rose here. Doesn't matter, they can go wet in wet together. I'm okay with that. This one is wet, so every time you got a wet one, you have to kind of skip to the next one. This one isn't next to a wet one, so we can skip to this one here. I'm gonna wet up to not right to the edge on this one, and I'm going to put a little touch of that yellow green, that little touch of that yellow green just up here. I don't know if you can see what I mean by a little touch. It's really small. And then the more bluey violet down here. Oh, it's not wet enough for the transition. It's get a little bit more wet. Bring it up so it just touches that green. And I've left that edge not very wet. So it's, we got a slightly different color going down in there. This one next to it here is similar. It's not a lot of color. Tiny bit. Tiny bit of violet shadow. Absolutely teeny. The next one along is much more of a greeny blue shadow. So I'm keeping a dry edge. I'm not going up to this one. I'm keeping a dry edge before going up, so I don't go up to the next one. And I'm getting that green, that very pale green, and I'm going to add a tiny bit of cobalt to that pale green, make it a little bit more blue. And put the shadow on this one. Number 2 brush, very delicate, and I kept a dry edge next to the other one. And this one behind here is quite a bluey green, so again I'm going to add a little bit more cobalt to my little bit and bringing it over here. When I say a little bit more cobalt, this is what I mean. A little bit more cobalt to my light green, because this one under here, I'm not wetting this one. I'm going to put the bluey green on first and use a wet brush this time to just ease that edge in. And I got more shadow behind this petal. Now we're going to sort of keep on working around, going clockwise, trying not to have any bleeding happening between the petals. They don't touch very much. On this side, they're much more bluey green, bluey yellowy green. So this one is quite light on the edge, and I'm going to get some of that more bluey green mix that I mixed, and bring it up to that light yellow edge. And underneath here, there's quite a blue violet one under there. It's quite shadowed. So I'm going into my blue violet, nice wet brush, because we don't want to get too much colour on there, but it is shadowed under there. And you may think it looks very dark at the moment, but wait till we get the dark green against it. I'm going to get a little touch of rose on my brush and just add the smallest touch of rose to it, so it floods into that bluey violet. So I'm going around. I want to think about maybe this one, this big one here. Leave those couple for a minute. This big one here, again, it's a more greeny blue with a little touch of violet. Make sure I got the right one. Doesn't really matter, they're just all petals. I'm going to wet this one. And use the greeny blue colour. A little bit more blue in it than that. Always start in the center where it's darkest. Leave the ends of the petals quite light. And this one has a little bit of the violet in it as well. So I'm going to do some wet in wet with the violet. Take the bluey violet and touch it deep in there. And then the pinky violet. And just bring it along here. Control it a little bit. And have those two colours on the petal. We'll miss the one next to it and go to the one under here, which is shadowed again. So tips are nice and light. And because they're in shadow, there's a little bit more blue in the greeny colour. Which one did I wet? That one, yeah. I can't see which one I got wet now. Pop that in there, that greeny blue. And under there, and then just leave the end of the petal a nice light, really nice light yellow. A little bit on that side. And right, looking at that one, yeah, right in here, again, I'm adding a touch of violet right in the center, because it does have some violet on it. Let's skip this one and then go to this one. This one is quite violet in the shadow. Oh, wet it. You must be getting better at wetting and putting the colour on as you do each of these, I'm sure. And the pinky violet, start at the centre. Let it come out. I'm drying my brush and then just sort of streaking it out with my brush. And there's a little bit of greeny colour just here. And some of the ones underneath are quite dark, so we won't worry about those too much. We'll miss this one and then skip one. Again, this one's quite dry that I started on, so we're going to go to this one. Wet the end of this. And this is quite pink. I'm going to use my more rosy violet. Because over this side, it's warmer on this side, more rosy. I'll get that down deep in there. Gonna get my brush down the centers as that center ridge I want to indicate, and then get my more bluey violet and a little bit more blue here and here, just a touch, not too much. Okay, let's see where we are. This one here has just a touch of rose, absolutely beautiful rose at the center, like the light is shining through it. So let's put some water on. We want it really, really light. And I'm going to get some pure rose color on my brush, no other color, just rose. And I'm going to touch it to that water here where the light is shining through, making it very rosy. I don't want it too strong, so I've got it on there, and then I'm going to use my brush to suck up a little bit of it so it's not too strong. And get a little bit of the rosy violet. There's a slight shadow just here, and I've just got a tiny bit of rosy violet just for a little bit of shadow there. Come around, as I come around, everything's drying, so this one is just fairly plain yellow. A little bit more stronger yellow on this one. I wet that one. I'm going to put just some stronger yellow on there. Like I say, this left-hand side is much warmer color, and this one here, I'm going to actually just put a bit more lemon yellow, like another layer, because the yellow's getting cooler as it comes over to the right-hand side. So I've got the lemon. For this one, I'm going to use just a touch more lemon on this one. And I'm going over to my deeper yellow just for this side over here in the center. It doesn't need a lot. Suck up a little bit of that. Trying to see which ones I've missed, if I've missed any yet. This one over here is quite a bluey yellow. I'll put water on this one. Go back to my greeny yellow. Get a little bit of the blue on that side. Has an absolute teeny touch of pink in it. Got a little bit of rose on my brush. Just bring a little bit of rose up here. That's a bold streak, so I'm going to have to take my thirsty brush and just suck a little bit of that up until it's a very, very subtle streak of rose on there. Around to this one. Again, this side is more green, so I'm going to get that yellowy green under there. Of course, being, you know, translucent petals with all those green lily pads behind them, they're going to have a lot of the green reflecting on them and from the underside too. So a little bit of blue on that side. A little bit of sucking up with my brush there. And this one coming out underneath is very blue-green. Let's finish that one off. Get my blue and my light green. And get the shadow in there. Right, let's skip that one for a moment and come down to this one. This one is very, very light with very little colour in. So it's still going to wet it so I can put just the teeniest bit of colour in there. I want tiny bit of violet close in there. This is the rosy violet. And here, very small amount. And then I want the very, very light green just on the edges, just there and there, just very little on there. I want to come around to this fat one here. It has a very, very pink center again, so just rose when we do the shading on this one. So wet this petal carefully. There's going to be a couple of streaks of green and violet on it, but I want to wait till everything's dry on that one to put that on. Just rose for now, and the rose is just in deep here. I put it nice and deep in there and just use the point of that little tiny number 2 brush to drag that rose out a little bit. Dry my brush a little bit and hold that out just a little bit more. I may need a tiny bit more. I can be a little bit more dramatic, I think, with the rose, as I know it will be much lighter when it starts to dry. This one has quite a nice dry edge next to it, so we shouldn't get any bleeding because it has a folded edge. So let's work on this one. And I'm going to put the nice bright yellow, your cadmium yellow or azo yellow. I'm going to put that on this one nice and bright. And then again, I'm going to get the rose on the tip of my brush and let it bleed wet in wet into that bright yellow. Not much water mixed with my rose because I want it to be quite strong, because it's going to get diluted by that wet yellow. This one next to it here, it's dry and I have some rose on the tip of my brush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to, onto that dry petal, I'm going to pull up some of those slightly stripy shapes, and then I've got a wet brush now. I'm going to ease those in. I had some rose on the tip of my brush. I didn't want to waste it, and that is the kind of pattern that you see in these petals, these stripes coming up from the center. Right, this one here, this petal here, is another one with very light with a little bit of rose on, like warm on this side of the flower. So wet this, maybe I'm going to add a touch more lemon yellow, just a bit more, give it a little bit more life, and tiny number 2 brush, and again right from the center, very little water on my number 2 brush so that I can control the rose and it's not going to go all over the place and flood out where I don't want it. So again, I'm going to streak and get it in the center and streak it out with the tip of my brush to meet that little bit of lemon that I put on there. It's a delicate process, isn't it? It's not quick. I bet you looked at this and thought, oh yeah, bung a yellow flower in the middle of some green leaves, well, we've done in no time. I thought that too. Now we haven't got many petals left to worry about. There's one sticking out back here that has a little bit of violet shadow. So same process, water I'm going with the bluey violet first, slightly more bluey violet anyway. And then I'll add a little bit of rose wet and wet to that. And grab a tiny bit of my rose again in the tip of my brush. And a few streaks of rose coming up there. Again, I have that rose here on my brush, and I know this petal is dry, and I just want to again put a couple of subtle streaks of rose that's coming up. And we're almost around the whole flower, getting the petals done. Then we can worry about the leaves on the outside. Got one more here, which is just a nice strong yellow. So just wet that one, get some, thanks Mike, get some Azo Yellow. I've got my tea again. I'm going to try and not put my paintbrush in it today. It's way out of my reach, so that's a good thing, I think. Put some nice bright yellow in there. I'll maybe grab the tiniest bit of that orangey red and just put a little bit of orangey red down here, close to the middle of that, just to deepen it a little bit. Right, what have I missed? I haven't done this one or this one. This one's probably in a more dry spot here than the others. It's very pale, so not a lot going on with this one. I'm going to put water. Where's my lemon? There it is. Water, a little bit of lemon on this side. And then a little bit of the green, tiny bit. And there's just, I think, just this one here, which is a pinky, it has a pinky look again, so tiny bit of lemon here, and the Quinacridone Rose, very little water, and bring the rose in, and then I'm going to manipulate that paint, put it in there, wet brush, clean brush, just manipulate that in so it's not too strong. Now the ones sticking out here they're more sort of like a leafy petal. They're more green and alizarin, these ones sticking out. So we'll have to address those in a moment when I think we'll work on this long stripy curled leaf here and some of the red alizarin-y spots. Probably need to speed this step up a little bit with the hairdryer, but it'll be a quick dry, so everything should be fine. So what I want to work on is this mottled leaf over here. I'm going to do it in, like I said, a different order and put the edgings on the red edgings on the leaf. And then we've got these sort of different color leaves or petals or something underneath we'll put on, and then we'll have a good going over with the hairdryer. So let's work on, I'm sorry if you're not ready, but we'll go ahead and you can fill in your petals later. Let's work on this folded leaf over here. I'm going to use my number 4 brush, and I have my yellow with, I have this yellow with Phthalo Green and this yellow that has Cobalt Blue, and I'm going to try the yellow with Phthalo Green because I think I want it really nice and vibrant. I don't want it too dark because We want all the dark leaves around it. So first of all, I'm going to put on that very yellowy green, and I'm also going to put that on the ones that are sticking out underneath that are this kind of red and green colour. There's one here. Sometimes I lose track of them. There's one there. There's one back here. There's one under here. And there's one under here. I'm going to make those that vibrant green to start with. And then I'm going to use, now you can use the alizarin crimson if you like. You can use alizarin crimson with a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm going to use my Perylene Maroon because it's that beautiful dark red. I can darken it later with a bit more burnt sienna, but really close to these petals, and make sure your petals are dry before you put this in. It's very dark. We'll probably even have to do a dark layer after this is dry. And leave. Now the edge of the petal underneath is this dark red too. And what we want to do is have it sort of bleed into the green a bit. So I'm going to use a bit more green on my brush. Doesn't matter if it goes kind of brown because it is kind of brown. It's all going to be deep dark underneath these petals. So I want that reddish edge to bleed into that green. I put a little bit more green on there. And I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna because I don't want it as bright as these outside ones, and I'm going to put a little bit of burnt sienna on there too, just to push it back under the other one. Now same with this little leaf sticking out. It doesn't matter if it bleeds into the green that you've got. We're going to put those kind of they're kind of triangular. We're not going to get super fussy about them, but they're kind of triangular shapes curling around this leaf. And if any of them get, like I'm thinking this one's a bit too bright, a bit too dry, I'm going to get my green and I'm just going to let it mix wet in wet in there. And actually down the length of the petal is quite light, so I'm actually going to put another light strip of wet in there. And keep putting in those triangles of colour. Again, get a little bit of green, mix it in wet. Suck any up that's going astray for you with your brush. Sort of gets lighter as it comes towards this end, so I'm adding a little bit more water to my red. And I'm leaving those sort of green stripes around, and I'm kind of leaving breaks in the green where the green stripe is. Just pulling. Some of them will get lost. You're doing a bit of wet on wet, and we're not sort of fussing with this too much. We're just getting that look of the light green and the red. And what we're going to do is, when this is dry, we're going to put the darker red strip down the middle. At the moment you won't get it dark red because it's too wet to have that dark red strip down the middle. We can do that later. It's pretty dark under here, and again we're going to darken that later. I'm going to mix my red with some burnt sienna for these ones underneath. They're a little darker. Soak up a little bit with my brush. One over here. Should have switched to my, I've still got my number 4 brush. I should have switched to my number 2 brush, but I wasn't paying attention. So maybe I will right now, because I'm getting to even smaller leaves back there. Put a little bit of the darker green on there. Get some of the dark red. And put that around the edge. That. And this one over here. Wet brush, ease it in under the petal. So you've got those those reddy brown leaves. Anytime I'm looking up and I'm seeing a bit too much pale color, just adding a bit more dark green where I see pale color. Just in here. Now what I want to do, that I didn't do before, let's just pull out a little bit. I didn't edge the edges of the leaves with the reddy colour. I put it in afterwards, and when I'd finished I thought, I think it would have been better to put that in before the green. You know, around, I'm going to get it quite wet, my little number 2 brush. And I'm going to bring that red around, and what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to have it super red all the way around. I've picked up some bright yellow on my brush, and I've put some bright yellow in there, and then I'm picking up now some bright red on my brush, and I'm letting that kind of flood into that bright yellow so that I have different colors coming around the edge. And then as it goes under here where it's dark, I'm adding a little bit of that burnt sienna red under there. And you don't see the red all the way around the edge of this, but you do see a bit here. And that will delineate it from the one behind it. And you see it around, there's definitely an edge on this one here. I'm trying to see them. There's some I haven't drawn in, but I'm looking at the photo and I can see one there. I can see one curled up here. I'm going to turn it sideways. I can't paint this one without turning. So again, I'm going to come up with the red, switch to the bright yellow, come up with the yellow, and then switch to the red. And you can see a little bit on this side. Now, a lot of this is going to disappear when you put the green on, so don't worry about it. And it's just to help you when you put the green on to figure out where your red's going to go. And I think it's easier to put it on first. There's a bit of a shape there. So we've got those in. We'll need a little bit more on the shaped leaf when this is dry. That's okay. And this is the point where I think I want to make sure everything's perfectly dry. Actually, what I could do while I have this dark red and doing dark paint, I think a good idea is to do the center of the flower, because it's a good time because we're going to dry it. So I want to get the cadmium red. I'm going to make a nice deep orange to do a little bit of negative painting. The cadmium red and the bright yellow make a nice deep orange color. And I want to do the negative painting between these stamens here. And I might even add a little bit of that Perylene Red in as well, so that they're a good, and my little number 2 brush, or if you have a number 1 brush, both will be helpful. So just in here, just between these stamens, I want to get it nice and dark. Just in a few spots, you know, under this one that curls around. In the center, definitely, I'm adding a little bit of that Perylene Maroon, that dark red, or your alizarin crimson into that red, and I'm going to put a bit more, let's zoom in so you can see a bit more what I'm doing. I'm going to put a bit more texture in the center here. There's not a lot of negative painting that you need to do in the center here, but enough that you really draw the eye in. I'm adding a little bit more yellow to that orange to make it more, bring this over, add a little bit more yellow to it to make it much more like a gamboge, or you can use gamboge, that's fine. And just add a little bit of depth to, and a little bit of my thin strokes in the center here, putting some little bit of detail on these petals, a little bit darker in some places, just while you've got the red going on and before we dry everything. Now what often happens is when you've finished everything, you might even want to put a little bit more dark in here, but this is good for now. And I'll zoom out again, and then I'm going to dry everything so we can put all the greens on without any bleeding. And I'm going to start in the top right with the sort of the most yellowish green lily pad that's there, and that's the one I want to put a bit of yellow and a bit of green on, so that they mix wet in wet, to have that kind of nice wet in wet look. So I've got my nice bright yellow, and I'm just going to splot that on. I now have my number 8 brush, gone to my bigger brush because I want to do some much bigger brush strokes, and I want my Sap Green, or your green mix with your blue and your, actually might add a little bit of Ultramarine Blue to it. My big brush, and I want to get that Sap Green, or a nice deep green, on before that yellow dries up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another brush, my number 6, I think, or 4, I'm not sure, just a smaller brush, and there's some sort of shapes coming out from the center of that lily pad, and I want to sort of just pull those out with my thirsty brush from the yellow center. Just, I've got a clean thirsty brush, and just pulling back some of the yellow just to make that kind of that look in the center of the lily pad. Now there will be much more shadow on it in the second layer of green, but this is our first layer. Now that's wet, so I want to come over to another place before I go back to any of the areas around that. So let's come down into this corner here. It's a smaller corner to paint in. And I want to go to one of the nice dark greens. So I want to use that sap green, but with some ultramarine blue added in to darken it up a bit. Not going super dark yet. We'll do that in the next layer. But I have that sap green, and then I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to get it up quite a bit darker. And I think I'll go with my number 6 brush. I don't want to be quite as big with the brush because it's a small spot. And let's start over in this corner. You'll probably never get your green dark enough in your first layer. I'm going to come up to the edge of that red that we put there. And get that corner of dark green in. Now you see, adding the ultramarine blue to the sap green really darkened that up. And I want to come on the other side of that red line that we had at the edge of the leaf. Doesn't matter if you go over in some places. Just going to put shadow over the red. I'm dipping my brush back in my paint lots, so I get nice rich paint to put these on. Here, and this one. The only thing with the hairdryer is I only use it during class because it lifts the tape off, and I try to avoid that in most situations. I usually go away for a couple of hours and just let everything dry, but we have a time limit, so I'm making sure I press it down again. Otherwise your paint just goes underneath your tape once the hairdryer lifts it up. It's a bit annoying. So we've got that dark in on that side. We will have to go a bit darker later. Going back to my bigger brush, I'm going to add a bit more ultramarine blue to that mix, because this one under here is even darker. I got a bit darker on my brush, and nice big brush so I can get these areas in with quick strokes. There, that's under this top leaf. And then because that's wet, I'm going to have to twist this around. And this one under here is quite dark too, so same big brush, because I want to get this in fairly quickly. Carefully though, because I don't want to go over any edges of petals or leaves. Dipping in my paint every few brush strokes. And get that side in. And over here. And twist it back around. Now, I can twist it back again. This one in here is not going to touch the outside because we're going to leave the dry red line in between. So I am going to twist it around to have to go in there. And grab my number 6 brush. I've got a bit smaller leaf to get into. I want to start with, it's kind of a lighter green inside, and then it gets darker. So I'm going to start with just sap green with no blue in it. Closest to this is just pure sap green, or you can have your mix of blue and yellow close to those petals. And then I'm going to dip into the one that is blue mixed with sap green as I come out to the edge, and being very, very careful. Use the point of my brush to make sure I keep that red edge on that leaf. This is, I think, as I've got a red edge there, so I think I can do this one without too much trouble. And I want to go back to my number 8 brush. So just thinking, I'm thinking about what colour I want to use. I think to start, that's why I say it's really hard, because we're going to have to put the shadow on afterwards, and right here is quite light. I'm going to put a little bit of water here because I want it quite light, and I'm going to add to my sap green, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow. I want to start off with quite a yellow green, and then we're going to come back with some shadows after we've got this layer on. So carefully, carefully, really carefully around the petals. And I'm just going to get my smaller brush and a little bit more bluey green. Even though we're going to put the shadow in afterwards, I'm going to start a little bit darker over here, because it's going to be a bit darker. And I know I wet it there, but it's really, like I said, on something this small, it's really hard to stop your paint running into the wet. So lifting, I'm going to lift a little bit here where it's light, where there's light reflecting off these leaves. So it was wet, paint's not dry yet, so I'm going to do a little bit of lifting to get that reflection. What I have to be very careful with is this can't dry while I'm doing that. I have to stop doing that lifting now and get this finished, or it will dry on me and I'll have a nasty line where it's drying. Got to remember we've got that petal underneath, and as it comes around here it's getting much darker, so I want to get the more bluey green as we come around here under these, much more bluey green. So this is my sap green with ultramarine blue added in. Keep that red edge on the leaf. And now I have that finished. Where's my Kleenex? I had a Kleenex a minute ago. I'll grab another one. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to get some of that. What I want is just to get some of that paint off the edge. I don't want it running back into the leaf. And I can still, I think, lift a little bit of this where it reflects the light here. And like I say, if you have some colors, you can lift them afterwards. Actually, looking at the photo, it's very, very different to how I saw it when I was drawing it, which is kind of interesting. When I was drawing it, I saw, oops, don't get your hand in it, Caroline. I saw some kind of a leaf up here, but it looks very weird on the photo, and I don't even know whether to have that there or just leave it. I think just leave it. Photo is very different to how I remember it. I don't think I had two. No, I didn't. Anyway, what I'm going to do, because I can see a little bit of red here, I'm going to just put that on there. And it doesn't matter if that red goes in wet. I don't really mind on those ones. I think it's going to be kind of fun to have it going in wet. So we're going to get now this big leaf here. So again, you want your number 8 brush, and I'm going to turn mine upside down because I don't want to get my hand in all of that wet paint. There's a lot of wet paint there. And going with my, I'm going to mix some Phthalo Green, some Sap Green, some Ultramarine Blue. Want to make this a bit brighter and a bit darker at the same time. So I'm just testing it on the corner. And it's darkest over here. So I want to start quite dark. And then I want to go lighter, so just Sap Green as we come over here. Be very careful around the edges of your petals. I'm going to go with a bit more yellowy green over here. So this one's got a bit more yellow mixed in as it comes over to this side. Keep your paint wet enough that you can get around the whole leaf and around the petals without anything drying up on you. You don't want it to dry on you before you get there. And I'm not talking because I'm really concentrating on not going over the edge of my petals there. And then of course not allowing any run backs into that by having it run back from my tape. And there were quite a lot of reflections on this leaf, and like I said, I took most of them out after I'd painted it by washing back. I'm going to try pulling a few out right now, but it's really hard. It seems a lot easier to do it after it's dry, but we'll try. I'm going to try lifting a few. I've got the thirsty brush, you know, it's clean and it's dry, and I'm just trying to lift off some highlights. I'll turn it back around the right way. There's one here. It's very kind of mottled with highlights. So what tends to happen, and is happening to me when you do this on wet paint, is you still get some really weird looks to it that are not as satisfying as taking those highlights off afterwards, after everything's dry. So there's one last very dark spot under here. Now this is where I want to go to the deep mix, which I've mixed with the Phthalo Green and the Perylene Maroon, or you can use Phthalo Green with alizarin Crimson. And I want to get that nice and dark under here, under these two lily pads here and here. Use that lovely, lovely dark mix to do that. There's also, coming into this lily pad, there is a split, you know, like they have that split in one side of them. So I want to get that in with this dark. And you can see how the Phthalo Green with the red makes this very, very dark green that's pretty much impossible to get just mixing blue and yellow or using one of the other greens. Now, because that has the Perylene Maroon in, I'm going to modify it. This is my mix here. I'm going to put some Perylene Maroon here, and it's going to make a browny maroon color, because I want to come in and do some depth to this curled leaf, but I don't want to do it with the dark green. But I can still use those two colors to put that depth in. I just use it with more maroon and less green, that's all. I want to have, there's a deep curl there in that leaf. There's also, grab a little bit of that dark color, there's also the curl in the middle where it goes, where it's curled together. So I'm putting that into, with a kind of a broken line. Sometimes if you do like a line that's not broken, it's a bit too much. Now at this point, I could probably put a little bit more of the red color on here. Now this has started to dry. I have to touch this green to make sure we're not going to get any weird bleeding of the red and the green. And I can add a little bit more red. And just ease it in with a wet brush. There's a little bit more near the center. And it's quite dark here. It's that, almost that browny red here. So I'm going to put some of that browny red on there. A bit more here, a bit more of the strong red on the edge. And I'm looking at this leaf under here. I'm going to use the rose actually. I'm going to use a bit of rose. This leaf under here is quite rosy. I'm going to put a little bit of the rose on there. And here. Let's rosy those up a little bit. And that's a little too dark. Sometimes you put it down as too dark and just stop, pick up something that's not as dark. And I'm modeling just a little bit more of this pattern on this curled up leaf. I'm being very kind of loose with it. You can be more precise if you like more precise. You can be more precise with this pattern. I'm just kind of being a little bit loose with it. Impressionistic. I don't want to fuss with all of the shapes too much. This flower is my focal point, so I don't want to be fussing too much with this leaf. A little bit over the edge of the petal there. Now it's still not dark enough close to the flower. Oh, we're getting past our finish time. I can't believe how long it takes to do some of these, but I think they're going to be quick. Anyway, so I really have to, I can't do the darker layer until this is dry. So I'm going to show you that you probably aren't even at this stage yet, so don't worry too much. I'm just going to show you the darker layer so that we can finish, and then you can sort of finish on your own time if it's hurrying you too much. But I'm going to use the hairdryer again just so I can put in the final darks. Okay, so when I'm painting something like this, at this point I usually like to wait a couple of hours until this is really, really dry before I put in the final dark layers, because even with the hairdryer, there's so much dampness still that you don't get that nice crispness that you can put in your darks. But we'll plow ahead anyway, and if you want to leave yours until after dinner when it's really dry, or tomorrow, it's probably easier to do that. But I want now to use the lovely dark one that I mixed with the maroon and the phthalo green. So I have that rich mixture. And I also want to use that mixture with some ultramarine blue in as well, because some of these shadows are quite blue. So I've got that same mixture with a bit of blue in. One of the areas where there's a fairly dark blue shadow is along here next to these petals right here, and it's pretty dark. So this is the Perylene Maroon and the Phthalo Green with some Ultramarine Blue mixed in to get a really good dark shadow there. And I'm adding a little touch of water at the edge. I don't want it too sharp. Bleeding a little bit too much. I'm going to add more blue and more water to that mix. And I want to get closer to these with some dark as well. And this is a very bluey mix for shadows. And you can see I'm coming out with dry edges, but I want to quickly soften those dry edges with my wet brush. And the reason I don't want to wet it all is because I know that this is going to flood into the wet paint really quickly. And there's all this reflection here, but there is texture in the leaf, so I can add a little bit of texture to it. But I got to get really deep down in here. Really deep dark green in here. And again, my wet brush is just going to ease that round the leaf so that it's dark close to the petals and coming out a little less dark close to the edge of the leaf. And under here is very dark too. Have to kind of play with it, because once you start adding the damp brush and pulling your paint out into the lighter areas, you can get some odd lines. But what we do have on the leaf is we have texture, so you can add that texture as well. I want to go back to that very dark mix that I made and put another layer of dark under here. And then my wet brush to ease that into the edge. Like the two layers really get the depth in there. Going to my very dark mix again. And making this leaf nice and dark. And I am going to just lift a little bit of light off of it. A little bit. All of these areas are really dark, so I'm going in with the Perylene Maroon and Phthalo Green to get that lovely darkness under these. Right under here too, it's very dark. You can see it's adding a lot of depth. Very dark under here. It's almost black. I want to get a good good deep mixture of that dark green here. And this lily pad up here is a very different green. It's a very bright green, but it is darker on the side next to this leaf. So for a much brighter green, we want the Phthalo Green with maybe the Sap Green or the yellow and some Ultramarine Blue. I'm going to add a bit of yellow to mine. See what that looks like. Yeah, that's... And then I've got my wet brush. I want to start where it's darkest and then pull some of those shapes to add a bit more blue. It's still a little bit greeny green. It needs to be a bit blue. I'm going to more sappy green. It's getting lighter as it comes around the side here. And what I'm trying to preserve is that shape of the yellow coming into the green. I'm going to soften all that off with a wet brush. There's a bit of a dark at the center too. This is still wet, so I can still add a bit more dark shadow on that side. Under this one, I'm not going to turn it for the moment. Again, the very dark one with the Perylene Maroon. And I think, I'll turn it around now, I think even this one can be much, much darker. It is in the photo. And again, I'm going to use my wet brush just to a slightly lighter green on my wet brush. Just take it down a little bit lighter here. And I'm looking at the photo and it's very dark under this leaf. So another layer of the Perylene Maroon and Phthalo Green under here. So we've got a lot of depth now. I can see a slight edge to a lily. I don't know if I've got enough time to just have a bit of an edge there. And then the only thing that needs to be a little bit darker is this one. And I will go with the more ultramarine and yellow one so that I can lift some of this back later. And then we're pretty much done. If you feel, and at that point when all the stark is in and you can look at your whole painting as a whole, then that's when you can decide if you need any more color on some of these, or some little lines of color. You can put in a little bit more color if you feel you need it, when everything else is, all the darks are in. I've just got this one more leaf. I'm going to turn it upside down, get my big number 8 brush, and I'm going to mix up the ultramarine and the yellow because I don't want it to be as dark. I'm going to take a little bit of that other dark green over here. There is a bit darker green here. I've just mixed the two together on the paper. But what I want to be able to do is lift those highlights out. And I just don't think that works when the paint's wet. I want to do it when the paint's dry. It's so difficult to get darks in one layer. You so often need 2 or 3 layers to get the darks, and that's why you really want your paints to be very transparent, like the Phthalo Green and the maroons and those kind of colors, so that you don't get a very thick, muddy look to your darks when you get them down. I have a little bit of bleeding here where I put that on too wet, and I'm going to try and tidy that up. I have a little tiny brush, clean Kleenex and very clean water, and I'm just going to try and tidy that edge up with a very clean brush. There. The other thing I could try, and I will try right now, is I'm going to take my crumpled up Kleenex and I just put all that wet paint on there, and I'm going to try dabbing off some of that highlight. I think that's going to work quite nicely. Dabbing off some of that highlight just with the Kleenex. And I will scrub a little bit off when it's dry. The other place I do a little bit of scrubbing when it's dry too is just here, just to soften up some of these shapes coming from the center of the lily. All of these things are usually much easier to do once the paint's dry. And you can get a much softer shape. The other place we have quite a bit of highlight is over here too, and again, if I use this little brush and scrub a little bit at the paint, I can get these much softer highlights. There's one here. And there's one along the leaf here too. And I think the big highlights that are on this big leaf over here are going to be, on my original one, I got them all off when the leaf was dry. And I think that's going to be the best way to tackle that, is to wait till it's dry. I'll take this dry one, and then when it's completely dry, where you see highlights, you can use a small stiff brush, just agitate it a bit and dab with your Kleenex, and you can get some really nice soft highlights off, especially if you've used like the ultramarine and the yellow. And there's quite a strong highlight here. So yeah, like I even used some of the Sap Green and the Phthalo Green, and I'm still able to pull some highlights off. And I painted this several weeks ago, so it's not new paint. It's been dry a while. And that highlight on that leaf there, so, and the edge here. And when I did this red, I put it in wet, and I think I prefer the look. Like we've got a crisper look putting it in before we put in the green, putting it on dry. And once your green is dry, if you want to darken up the red a little bit, you certainly can. I can put a little bit more in. So at this point, I want to let this all dry before I make any decisions, before I lift off any paint. And I might, well, even now I could probably, what I might consider doing is putting just a little bit more lilac in places, which would be great if I had any palette left that was clean. Let's grab a little bit. I've washed off all my lilac. Get my really teeny tiny brush. And I do think that a couple of these could have just a little bit more lilac shading on them. And like I said, there's a ridge sort of down the center of the petal, and you can form that ridge by doing the lilac on dry petals. Just in a couple of those petals to make them a bit more dramatic. This one has a bit more pink. A little bit more pink coming out of there. So working on the dry petal makes it quite easy, and then you can use your wet brush to just ease those in. So I can still give it a little bit more dimension after everything's dry by sort of working on a couple of areas like that. If I feel it needs a bit more depth, a little bit more detail, especially on your petals, but not too much. If you work on them too much, you'll end up losing that translucency and that beautiful vibrancy of your flower. It's worth going away and looking at it the next day, because you'll see it entirely differently the next day when you look at it, when everything's really dry, when your colors are showing up. Just adding a tiny bit more depth under some of those petals under there, that's all. You definitely don't want to do too much, or you're going to lose how lovely it looks. I'm not going to, I'd like to take the tape off because it's going to look so much better with tape off, but I don't want to, because I want to do just a little bit more work on lifting, and I want it to dry naturally for 24 hours before I do that. I hope you enjoyed painting that lily and yours turned out well. Sometimes you need to wait till a couple of days after to look at it again, and you like it more, I think, when the paint's dried and you can see it as a whole painting, not a little series of parts that you did. So join me again next week. Next week we'll be painting some vases of flowers, and just keep painting, hang in there, and thanks for joining me.